The human mind is capable of incredible calculated brilliance, but in the darkest corners of society, it is also capable of unspeakable cruelty. For decades, criminologists and the FBI have attempted to build profiles to catch the ghosts who haunt our streets. Most predators rely on an absolute rule of fear to paralyze their victims. But every so transitionally, a predator crosses paths with an individual whose sheer intelligence, focus, and survival instinct completely shatters their pattern. Today we dive into 5 of the most high-intensity, dark cases in United States history, where the boundary between a tragic cold case and ultimate justice rested entirely on a single microscopic clue, a hidden memory, or a victim who refused to let the darkness win. In the sweltering summer of 1984, a suffocating cloud of terror descended upon the Tampa Bay area of Florida. One by one, young women were vanishing into thin air in the dead of night. They were taken from bus stops, parking lots, and quiet suburban neighborhoods. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no immediate clues left behind. The local police department and the FBI were completely empty-handed. They were chasing a ghost, a highly organized serial killer who used the vast highway system to strike and disappear. The man hiding behind the steering wheel was Robert Joe Long. To his neighbors, he was an ordinary cinema technician. But beneath that boring facade lay a hyper-calculating predator. He spent his nights driving a vintage red Dodge station wagon, hunting for isolated targets. By the autumn of 1984, he had taken 8 lives, and the task force was operating at a total dead end. Then came the early morning hours of November 3, 1984. 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh was riding her bicycle home after a grueling late-night shift at a local donut shop. The streets were pitch black. Suddenly, Long's vehicle pulled up beside her. Before she could scream, Long ambushed her, forcing her into the back seat at gunpoint. He tied a thick, tight blindfold over her eyes, plunging her into total darkness, and drove her back to his apartment. But Long had severely underestimated his captive. Lisa possessed an extraordinary bulletproof survival instinct. Realizing that fighting back physically would result in her immediate death, she made a brilliant tactical decision. She would use total psychological compliance to stay alive, while transforming her remaining senses into a forensic tool. More importantly, she knew she had to leave a physical trail behind. Whenever Long looked away, she intentionally pressed her fingertips firmly against his headboard, the bathroom mirrors, and the glass surfaces of the apartment, deliberately leaving clear, high-quality latent fingerprints. She then began talking to Long, using deep empathy to disarm his rage, convincing him she was his friend. After 26 grueling hours, completely manipulated by her compliance, Long drove her back out to an isolated road and let her walk away alive, confident she would never tell a soul. The moment his car sped off, Lisa ran to a phone and dialed 911. She provided the police with an incredibly precise forensic map of his apartment, his route, and a description of his car's interior, which was lined with unusual, vibrant red carpeting. Forensic teams swarmed her wardrobe, vacuuming her clothes. Under the microscope, they found unique, trilobal red nylon carpet fibers that matched the exact fibers found on the previous 8 homicide victims. On November 15, 1984, the trap was sprung. Undercover units spotted Long's red station wagon and pinned him in a local bank parking lot with tactical vehicles drawn. When confronted with the mountain of evidence Lisa had planted, including her matching fingerprints on his mirror, Long broke down and confessed to all 8 murders. He was handed multiple life sentences and executed in 2019. Lisa McVeigh took her trauma and turned it into power. She entered the police academy and spent her career as a highly decorated law enforcement officer, protecting the very same community where she was once hunted. The suburbs are often built on the illusion of absolute safety. We assume that behind the manicured lawns and identical fences of our neighbors, nothing truly sinister can exist. But on June 10, 1991, in the quiet mountain town of Myers, California, that illusion was shattered in broad daylight. 11-year-old J.C. Dugard dressed in her favorite pink outfit and began her normal walk to her school bus stop. Halfway up the hill, a strange gray sedan pulled up beside her. Within seconds, a man rolled down the window, tased her into unconsciousness, and dragged her into the car. Her stepfather witnessed the abduction from his front yard and frantically chased the car on a bicycle, but it vanished down the highway. The kidnapping triggered one of the largest manhunts in Northern California history. Roadblocks were set up, bloodhounds combed the mountains, and the FBI launched a sweeping federal investigation. But investigators were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: distance. The people who took J.C. didn't live anywhere near the mountains. They had driven her 120 miles away, completely out of Tahoe, and deep into the suburban town of Antioch, California. The man driving the car was Philip Craig Garrido, a high-risk convicted sex offender who was actually on active federal parole. Beside him was his wife, Nancy Garrido. Together, they drove the terrified girl directly to their home at 1554 Walnut Avenue. For the next 18 years, J.C. Dugard became a ghost to the outside world. Philip Garrido forced her into a hidden compound in his backyard, a literal labyrinth of concealed tents, sheds, tarps, and fences that was completely invisible to the neighbors. For the first several years, she was locked inside a soundproofed, dark shed, subjected to horrific repeated assaults. Over the years of her captivity, J.C. gave birth to 2 daughters, fathered by her captor, when she was just 14 and 17 years old. The ultimate question the FBI faced later was simple: how did nobody notice? Walnut Avenue was a tightly packed neighborhood, and because Garrido was a high-risk parolee, parole officers visited the house dozens of times over those 18 years. But Garrido was a master manipulator. He kept the backyard gates locked, ran a small printing business from his home, and convinced authorities he was a reformed, deeply religious man. The officers never walked to the very back of the property. They never looked behind the tarps. J.C. and her daughters were hiding in plain sight, just yards away from safety, while the system completely failed them. The date that changed everything was August 24, 2009. Philip Garrido decided to take his delusions to the campus of UC Berkeley, bringing 2 young girls with him to pass out religious flyers. His erratic behavior caught the eye of campus police officer Ally Jacobs. She noticed the 2 young girls looked pale, unkempt, and overly submissive. When Officer Jacobs ran Garrido's background, a massive red flag popped up. He was a convicted kidnapper on active federal parole. Jacobs immediately contacted his parole officer, who was stunned. He had no record of Garrido having any children. Garrido was ordered to report to the parole office the very next day and bring everyone with him. On August 26, 2009, Garrido walked into the office, confident he could lie his way out. While investigators interrogated Garrido in one room, a veteran special agent sat down in a separate room with the woman calling herself Alyssa. He looked closely at her, noticing her intense panic, and asked for her real name. The brainwashing of 18 long years fought against her, but she looked at her daughters, looked back at the agent, and whispered the words that sent a shockwave through the building. I was kidnapped in 1991. Police moved in instantly. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested on the spot, and a convoy of forensic units swarmed Walnut Avenue, tearing down the hidden tents. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life, and Nancy was sentenced to 36 years to life. Today, J.C. is a published author and motivational speaker, running a foundation to help families heal from trauma, proving that hope can win even after decades in the shadows. On the night of June 5, 2002, in the affluent, deeply safe neighborhood of Federal Heights in Salt Lake City, Utah, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart went to sleep in the bedroom she shared with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. Doors were routinely left unlocked in this close-knit community. But as the clock ticked past 3:15 a.m., a shadow moved across the back patio. A lone intruder quietly sliced through a window screen, entered the home, and navigated the dark hallways with terrifying familiarity. He walked straight into the girl's bedroom. Elizabeth woke up to a hand pressing down firmly over her mouth, and a cold knife pressed against her throat. A low, calm voice whispered that if she made a single sound, he would murder her entire family. Wearing nothing but her pajamas, she was forced out into the chilly night. Just feet away, her 9-year-old sister Mary Catherine hid under the covers, paralyzed with absolute terror. The kidnapping ignited a massive media storm. Over 2,000 volunteers combed the hillsides and the FBI launched a massive investigation. Yet investigators were looking in all the wrong places. The kidnapper hadn't fled the state. He had forced Elizabeth to hike barefoot up into the dense foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, just 3 miles away from her front door. From that ridge, Elizabeth could literally hear the distant megaphones of the search parties. But a knife to her throat kept her silent. The man behind the blade was Brian David Mitchell, a homeless street preacher who called himself Emmanuel. Beside him was his devoted wife, Wanda Barzy. Mitchell believed he was a divine prophet, and he had targeted Elizabeth after being hired by her mother for a single day of casual handyman work months prior, using that time to map the house. At the mountain campsite, Elizabeth was subjected to extreme psychological conditioning, starvation, and daily assaults. Mitchell stripped her of her clothes and identity, renaming her Shirashub and forcing her to wear heavy white robes and a thick mesh face veil to completely conceal her features. With this disguise, Mitchell boldly marched her through public grocery stores and buses. To anyone passing by, they looked like an eccentric religious group. No one looked closely enough to see the missing girl behind the veil. The breakthrough happened 4 months later. 9-year-old Mary Catherine, constantly replaying the intruder's voice in her head, suddenly had a memory unlock. She ran to her parents and revealed that the voice belonged to Emmanuel, the handyman from a year ago. The Smart family bypassed the skeptical police and released a sketch of Mitchell to the national media in February 2003. The date that shattered the nightmare was March 12, 2003. The trio was walking down a public street in Sandy, Utah, just 18 miles from Elizabeth's home. Sharp-eyed citizens recognized Mitchell's face from the television broadcasts and dialed 911. Within minutes, police cruisers intercepted them. Elizabeth, deeply brainwashed, initially gave a false name, terrified Mitchell would kill her family. But the officers made a critical tactical decision. They separated her from Mitchell and moved her into a patrol car. Away from his gaze, a veteran officer gently asked her to step out from behind the veil, telling her that her family was desperately looking for her. As the mesh cloth dropped away, exposing her face to the sunlight, she whispered, "I am Elizabeth Smart." Mitchell was sentenced to life in federal prison. Elizabeth refused to let her captivity define her, transforming her experience into power by becoming a world-renowned child safety activist and author. On the afternoon of May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan stood on the side of a highway in Eugene, Oregon, trying to hitchhike her way down to Northern California for a friend's birthday party. Colleen was a cautious free spirit, turning down several rides from drivers who made her feel uneasy. Then, a blue Dodge van pulled over. Inside was a picture-perfect, wholesome young family, a clean-cut man named Cameron Hooker, his wife Janice, and their innocent newborn baby. Looking at the mother and infant, Colleen felt completely safe and climbed in. For the first few hours, the conversation was perfectly friendly. But as the van crossed into California near an isolated stretch of road near Red Bluff, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Cameron pulled off the highway onto a deserted dirt track, turned around with a hunting knife, and threatened her life while his wife watched in total silence. He forced a heavy, custom-made wooden box over Colleen's head, plunging her into suffocating darkness, and pushed her into the back of the van. Cameron drove Colleen to his modest suburban home. To the neighbors, he was a quiet, skilled woodworker. But down in his basement, he forced Colleen into a custom-built wooden box hidden directly underneath the couple's waterbed. The dimensions were horrifying: 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and less than 1 foot high. It was shaped exactly like a coffin. For the next 7 years, this box became Colleen's entire world, locked inside it for 23 hours a day. The absolute sensory deprivation completely broke her mind, causing her to lose all track of days and seasons. The only time it was opened was when Cameron allowed her out to perform forced manual labor around the property, or endure horrific abuse. Cameron had lined the basement walls with soundproof insulation. Neighbors routinely waved to him as he mowed his lawn, completely oblivious to the nightmare, just feet below the grass. By the early 1980s, physical chains were no longer necessary because Cameron had enslaved her mind. He presented her with a typed formal contract from a fictional crime syndicate he called the Company. He told her that the Company monitored her every move, and if she ever tried to run or speak to a neighbor, they would instantly assassinate her parents and siblings, showing her stalking photos of her family home to prove it. Brainwashed, Colleen signed it. The mental prison was so strong that Cameron began letting her work as a nanny for his kids and introduced her to neighbors as his maid. He even took her to visit her real parents in Oregon, where she lied to their faces, telling them she was happy before willingly getting back into the van to return to her prison. The psychological walls finally cracked in 1984. Cameron's wife, Janice, grew increasingly terrified that Cameron would target their own growing daughters next. Overwhelmed by religious guilt, she confessed to a local pastor, who told her she would face damnation if she didn't free the captive. On August 9, 1984, while Cameron was at work, Janice went to the basement and pulled Colleen out. Colleen initially refused to leave, terrified of the Company, until Janice revealed it was all a lie. Colleen boarded a bus home, finally free. In November 1984, Janice went to the police, trading her testimony for immunity. Forensic units swarmed the property, pulling the wooden coffin boxes out into the daylight. Cameron Hooker was found guilty and sentenced to 104 years in prison. Colleen reclaimed her life, earned a degree, and dedicated her future to helping trauma survivors. On the morning of February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen was home alone in her townhome in Van Nuys, California. Sherry was an accomplished director of nursing who had recently married the love of her life, John Ruetten. But a dark shadow had been looming over their marriage. John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, had taken the breakup incredibly hard. Stephanie was a badge-carrying rookie officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. For months, she had been showing up unannounced at their home in full uniform, even cornering Sherry at her hospital workplace, warning her, "If I can't have John, nobody else will." On that rainy morning, John left for work. Sherry, homesick, heard a heavy knock at the front door and walked down to open it, completely unaware she was facing a highly trained killer. Later that evening, John returned to total chaos. The living room was completely trashed. Vases were shattered, furniture overturned, and blood smeared across the walls. In the center of the room lay Sherry, brutally beaten and shot 3 times in the chest at point-blank range. The LAPD swarmed the residence and quickly formulated a theory: a residential burglary gone wrong, noting that audio equipment was stacked near the door. Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, begged the lead detective to look into Stephanie Lazarus, detailing the stalker campaign, but the detective completely dismissed his pleas, refusing to look into one of his fellow officers. The trail went cold for over 2 decades. Stephanie Lazarus continued her career unhindered, climbing the ranks to become a high-level detective in the prestigious art theft detail, working in the very same building as the homicide division. But in 2004, a cold case forensic analyst discovered an overlooked piece of evidence in the file, a cotton swab containing DNA collected from a deep bite mark on Sherry's arm. The analyst processed the swab. expecting to find a male burglar. Instead, the profile belonged to a female suspect. The burglary theory evaporated. Sherry had been killed by a woman in a personal act of rage. In 2009, an elite tactical cold case unit took over the file with absolute stealth. They discovered that days after the murder, Stephanie had reported her personal .38 caliber revolver stolen, the exact caliber used to kill Sherry. Undercover surveillance teams shadowed Stephanie off-duty, watching her discard a plastic cup into a public trash can. The cup was retrieved, and the DNA matched the 1986 bite mark with 100% certainty. On June 8, 2009, the trap was sprung. Two homicide detectives casually asked Stephanie to help them interview an art theft suspect in basement interrogation room 503. Stephanie, suspecting nothing, unholstered her service weapon and followed them down. The cameras captured a masterclass in interrogation. As the questions shifted from her early career to John Ruetten, Stephanie's body language turned ice cold. She began to stammer, fidget, and try to change the subject. When they revealed they had her DNA from the murder scene, she panicked and tried to walk out, but handcuffs were produced. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life, proving that no badge can hide the truth forever.